Good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education. It is Wednesday, February 9th, 2 p.m. Before we get started, just to give those who are following our work an understanding of where we're at with bills. We have been working on a miscellaneous education bill, which we will hear from the agency in the next day or so on. We have been working diligently on church and state issues, which we'll pick up today and hopefully finalize within the next week. We're looking at S-162 today. We also have work on a mascot bill that we've been working on, and a Holocaust studies bill, which I would say is now sort of transitioning into an appropriation conversation to support our agency of education. We also have PCBs and lead that we're going to be looking at this week, and a teacher recruitment / support bill. So no short of work, but for those of you who have been following our work, I think we're nearing time to vote on a few of those key pieces of legislation. So that's just a quick summary of where we're at. Today we're picking up S-162, an act relating to collective bargaining rights for teachers. This is a bill that was introduced by Senator Perchlik. Senator Perchlik has given an overview. We've also had a conversation with Ledge Counsel. But before we jump into it, Senator Perchlik, I'm wondering if you have any additional comments or anything that you want to say to the committee at this point related to the work.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we can just jump right into the witnesses.
Okay, great. All right, so with that, Mr. Nichols, thanks for being with us.
Hi, Senator. It's my understanding that Superintendent Tucker was going to go first because he had a conflict, and Jeff Francis had called me early this morning, and we were fine with that if that works for your committee.
That's fine. It's Mr. Tucker. Yes, there he is. Mr. Tucker, thanks for joining us. You are the superintendent at the Caledonia Central Supervisory Union.
Yes, I am. Yeah, and thank you for accommodating my schedule. I appreciate it. Thank you, Jay. I'll just jump right in. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Vermont Superintendents Association. I speak today in opposition in whole and in part to the proposed amendments to 16 VSA 1752. First is my objection to the changes that would allow teachers to continue to seek employment after having signed a contract with their district for the upcoming school year. By my count, this is the third year in a row that this proposal has come up, and I wish to have this committee understand how disruptive this proposal is to our ability to meet our obligations to the students that we serve. A contract is a contract is a contract. The idea that someone can sign a contract and then actively seek to break that contract defies common sense and is an affront to common practice. I would venture that every Vermont NEA collective bargaining agreement is structured similar to our CBAs in Caledonia Central, which I footnoted it in my written testimony. I won't read the footnote here. Teachers already are afforded a great deal of deference in the contracting arena. The language relating to renewal is already weighted in favor of the teacher because of tenure, unless there is just cause to non-renew a determination that is reached only after the district has navigated an employee-friendly and employer-onerous due process procedure that is only undertaken in the most extreme cases. The renewal of the teacher's contract is automatic. Because of this commonality in renewal terms, teachers across Vermont make employment decisions every year in a predictable manner. We're strictly limited by date as to when we can invoke a reduction in force. Once that date passes, we are constrained from making staffing changes. Teachers know the contracts are offered in April. They know they typically have a month to sign their contract. They also know that requests for an extension on the deadline for signing can be made and will almost always be granted. Case in point, last year I extended the deadline for a high school math teacher, which happens to be a position on the AOE's critical shortage list, 3 times before she finally secured a new position. This is not a teacher that we wanted to lose, but I was mindful of the fact that she was commuting a long distance and was tired of doing so. During these extensions, we were effectively precluded from seeking a replacement, since she could at any time during an extension period have simply signed her contract. I could have forced the issue with her at any time, but I didn't because I am sensitive to the issue of not forcing someone to work where they did not wish to work. However, because her contract status was not resolved until June, we were left to search for a replacement in the summer months, an experience that is akin to fishing in a dry lake bed. We almost opened the school year with no high school math teacher in place at that school. My example is one isolated case in which I played an active role. The proposal to allow continued job searches after a contract is signed would institutionalize a practice whereby I, as superintendent, have no say in managing the disruptions that would result. We rely greatly on knowing when school lets out in Jim that we have a full roster of teaching professionals. This is important to us for many reasons that go beyond simple sanity. We often plan and schedule paid summer professional development for staff, and having gaps in the roster can make such professional development less effective. One last point about contracts. It sometimes happens that a teacher who signed a contract finds him or herself in a situation that makes it difficult to follow through with a commitment. We have seen a few of these situations during the past 23 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. A teacher finds it necessary to move back home to care for family members is the typical circumstance. When this happens, I have always released a teacher from his or her contract with no assertion of my rights under Section 1752 regarding a licensing violation. Within the current structure and process for contracting for teachers, there was already—
Sorry, Mr. Tucker, I'm going to interrupt you there just because you're on a point that I'd like to ask a question about.
Oh, sure.
Can you say something about Section 1752? What are the penalties if all of a sudden somebody, 2 months into a job or at some point decides they cannot fulfill their contract? Would you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. The piece that I was referring to, there's language in 1752. I'm sorry, I don't have the section right in front of me.
That's okay.
That if a teacher were to break a contract and just walk away from his or her job, that we're entitled to, or actually required to, report that teacher to the licensing division of the Agency of Education. And under statute, that teacher is precluded for taking another teaching job in a public school in Vermont for the remainder of that school year. That's in the case of somebody who had an emergency and needed to, and said, I have to move back home. My mother's sick, my father's sick, whatever. I wouldn't invoke that. I would say that that's a reasonable excuse to be excused from your contract, and I would release a teacher from the contract. That's what I was referring to.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you letting me interrupt you. So it's left to your discretion as the superintendent whether or not to report that person.
It's left to my discretion whether or not to release the teacher from the contract. If I release a teacher from a contract, there's no violation. It's not like they're walking away. And I would counter, the counter to that is I did have a teacher, 2 teachers this year who quit without warning and walked away from their contracts. And those 2 teachers were reported to the agency because they did it with no consultation, no explanation. They just said, I'm done, I'm leaving, and they walked away. So it's really about being flexible and working in considerations of the needs of the teachers. If I had a teacher that just decided on Friday afternoon that he or she was done and was leaving and gave me no opportunity to work with that teacher, then I would consider that a licensing violation.
Okay, thank you.
So let's see where I left. So within the current structure and process for contracting for teachers, there's already sufficient flexibility built in to accommodate out of the ordinary situations. Allowing a teacher to continue seeking new positions and then break his or her contract is totally a one-sided proposition that may advantage teachers, but will create a significant disruption for districts who have to know they have staff signed up for the next school year. While I believe that this provision would cause serious disruption to the orderly operation of my schools and should therefore be rejected in whole, if this body feels this privilege should be extended to teachers, I would ask you to level the playing field along the following lines. Teachers who wish to continue seeking alternate employment after seeking a contract must provide written notice to the superintendent. Upon receipt of such notice, the superintendent may post the teacher's position as an anticipated opening, and if a suitable candidate is found, may break the contract and hire the other candidate. Teachers who are hired in this way cannot continue to seek alternate employment under the provisions of this amendment. In regards to termination of a licensed teacher, I turned to another section of this proposed amendment. That's section C, page 3, lines 7 and 9. It should be clear that teachers are afforded due process rights in cases of termination, but this added language in that section opens the door for the union to assert in negotiations, as mine has, and we're taking it up again in another hour or two in negotiations, to assert in negotiations that they need to have language allowing appeals under the grievance clause of our collective bargaining agreement. This would result in teachers getting 2 bites at the apple. In other words, the ability to grieve a termination under the guidelines of the CBA after losing an appeal of dismissal under the provisions of section 1752. I think that door should remain closed. Finally, the added language under F, page 5, lines 9 to 11 is a solution in search of a problem. I would never discipline a teacher for testifying before the legislature, nor would any superintendent that I know. We have policies in place that recognize employees' free speech rights. Testifying before the legislature, as I'm doing here, would be considered a free speech right in policy and in common sense. Furthermore, as written, there would be no recourse for response in the face of inaccurate or defamatory statements before this public body. I urge you to set this section aside. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. Any questions for Mr. Tucker before I ask a couple? Well, I think one question that I do have is I'm thinking about the teacher that, well, let me go back. It does strike me as, and these are of course early days on this for me dealing with this issue, but it does strike me as rather punitive to have a teacher not be allowed to be licensed, that whole reporting. It just, there's something there where, you know, and again, I'm not in your seat, and I'll also say that I feel that, you know, I'm still learning about this issue. So if a teacher needs to take a position or wants to, let's just say, leave the career, or really doesn't feel as though, for whatever reason, I guess it begs the question, do you want that teacher there? I mean, if all of a sudden somebody says, hey, I'm leaving, this school isn't working for me, it just seems to me that you trust that person's sort of professional decision. But I guess these are more my thoughts, things I'm just trying to figure out. I feel free to respond. It's just,
Well,
again, just sort of early days in learning about these issues.
Senator Campion, I don't disagree with the premise of what you just said.
Uh-huh.
If somebody doesn't want to work in my school, doesn't want to be there, I don't want that teacher working with my kids.
Right.
The issue is around, you know, I hope the committee doesn't get distracted around that issue of reporting a teacher for a licensing violation. That's a very narrow responsibility, which is actually laid on me. I'm told I have to do that. And the intent of that is to prevent teachers from, you know, quitting in my district and then just jumping over and going to work for, you know, Amy Minor or one of my other superintendents in the district because they just feel like leaving. So that language has been in place as long as I know, and as far as I know, is not being proposed to be removed unless I've misread this amendment to the bill. I think the larger issue here remains institutionalizing the notion that when a teacher signs a contract, they're not really, you know, it's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod. They're not held accountable to having committed to the school district and can continue to shop around for jobs and leave. I can tell you that it was a very difficult proposition for us trying to replace a high school math teacher in the months of July and August. We barely got somebody, and I think if I'm remembering exactly right here, I think we signed a contract with a replacement teacher 2 days before school started. This teacher had no time to prep for the new school year. He's doing a good job, but this is not, I mean, this is no way to run a railroad. We have to be able to project out and plan and know that we have teachers in place. And I would just remind the committee that the intent of that is for the stability of the system overall, which is really in place for the benefit of the kids. This is not for my benefit. It's not for the teachers' benefit. We run schools for the kids, and this harms kids.
I appreciate that. I guess my final question, I'm waiting for Ledge Council to join us, but just contracts in general in the state of Vermont, this committee, we're going to jump into a little bit at some point, because I know everybody has or not everyone, but a lot of people have contracts and work from contracts, and just what are the sort of the legal ins and outs of contracts in the state, when can they be broken, et cetera. Other questions from the committee? Senator Perchlik.
Well, I know we have whatever, 3 other superintendents, a couple of principals, and maybe it's better after that, but basically either Superintendent Tucker or others can talk about how the process, because it sounded like from that testimony a little different than the way I understood it on April 15th date, that the teachers don't know about other jobs because the schools don't know about who's coming back. And so that's why there should be some hiring period where there's kind of an opening, because my understanding talking to teachers, they felt like they had to sign the contract, but they don't know if there's a job opening that they want, because that school it's all happening on the same day. And if that's not accurate, then that would be good to know. But that's how it was, presented to me that's part of the problem that we're trying to address.
Do you want me to respond to that, or do you want to wait for the others to speak?
Well, sure. I looked to Senator Perchlik. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Senator Perchlik, I think that, that's a very narrow view of the contracting process, and it ignores the fact that teachers who are thinking that they might want to relocate to a different area of the state have the opportunity under every collective bargaining agreement that I know of to say to their superintendent, first of all, they have a month. And second of all, they can say, I am actively looking for jobs and I would like a 2-week extension. Or in the case of my high school math teacher, she ended up needing, 5 or 6 week extension because the district that she was interested in going to was having difficulty making up its mind about who to hire, and they ultimately hired her. And I waited it out with her. So it's not absolutely the case that April 15th everybody's done, and that's a common date. Some districts are on a slightly different schedule, but April 15th for contract offering and May 1st or May 15th for acceptance is a typical window. But there is some flexibility built into the system. It can't, it can't be a system that's totally weighted to the benefit of the teacher with a resultant harm to the districts, is what I'm suggesting to you with all due respect. We have to run our systems.
Personally.
Yeah, and I agree totally. It's not my intent to lopsided the situation or the power imbalance. But I guess we can wait till we hear from others on if more flexibility is needed in that, other than asking for permission, or if it's clear that there's always a month that's open there. And I totally agree with you that it's about what's best for the kids. And so that's not my intent, and that is why this bill differs from the House version that doesn't have an end date. And so I did put a June date, thinking that you can't just string the school out forever. Like you said, trying to find a math teacher in August is not fair. And I'm not wedded to June 15th. It could be an earlier date, but that's why I did feel that there's at least a date. There needs to be a date certain for sure.
Sure. I would just, I would say, if somebody told you that April 15th is a drop dead date, that's not the case. It's at least 2 weeks and usually 4 from the date that the contract is offered.
Okay. Any final comments, Mr. Tucker? Any final questions for Mr. Tucker before we move back to the top of the list? Okay, thank you, Mr. Tucker. Mr. Nichols.
Thank you for.
You bet.
Good afternoon, committee. I think this is like the second or third time I've tested on this bill or a version of this bill. And I'm going to keep my comments short so you can hear from a couple of principals and some superintendents. I do appreciate that Senator Perchlik has a date in there. Certainly that's better than the House bill that has no date. The only problem with the date, and I just want to comment on this before I forget, is that it's after everybody's gone home. So when you're doing a hiring process, the superintendent, at least the way I did it, is I would want the candidates to be interviewed by committees of my teachers and my support staff And I would require the candidates to come in and actually teach a mock lesson to my students so the kids could actually weigh in on it. And if you do it in the summer, it's too late. So really the hiring season needs to be done before the end of May, or you're pretty much too late. So just for my overall testimony, this bill would essentially move a locally bargained hiring window to essentially an open hiring season that would adversely impact students in rural areas and students in districts that pay lower than other districts close to them. As a former superintendent and principal in poverty areas, even under current law, we always felt that rural schools and lower spending schools, and thus their students, were at a tremendous disadvantage. This bill would further that disadvantage. It's much harder to hire and retain teachers in areas of the state that are remote and that pay less than their neighbors. On Monday, 2 Vermont principals who had previously worked in New Hampshire, who has a system where it's pretty much open hiring season, shared stories about what a nightmare August was for school leaders, and that because of a lack of appropriate deadline, teachers would leave whenever they wanted, and that a contract was basically a requirement for school districts, but simply a piece of paper with no meaning in terms of employee accountability to the district, and ultimately, most importantly, to the students. So the poorest districts there often are left at the beginning of the year with unqualified teachers teaching their students. As the committee may know, the Vermont State Police many years ago realized that they had a major pay differences for different parts of the state, and they were more likely to have people that would want to serve in certain parts of the state because they paid more. My understanding is that the state police then went into a statewide police contract agreement. If we wanted to do something like that, have a statewide teachers contract, the VPA would certainly be willing to participate in that process. We support anything that is beneficial to all kids and generally oppose anything that hurts some kids at the advantage of others, which we believe this bill would do. And the principals are going to talk about the impact there. So I just want to comment a little bit on the language around testifying, and then I'd be glad to answer any questions. This is an issue that's pretty passionate for me, and I'd be glad to discuss it or help with any kind of solution. So I'm wondering about the new proposed language. Teachers shall not be subject to discipline by the teacher's employer for testifying before the GA or a committee of the GA or before the state board. I just want to be careful about this language. Does this mean that a teacher can violate FERPA rules? Can they give specific examples about students and children that are in their classes? It is very likely that the information they provide could be easily identifiable because our schools are so small. Could they share confidential information about school planning, reduction in force decisions, or even disciplinary action? Could they even share things that are factually incorrect, especially knowingly factually incorrect? Does a school district have no recourse in that type of situation? Just something to think about. I
appreciate that. I appreciate that, Mr. Nichols, but is it in statute that you and principals and superintendents, do we say that, you can't share misinformation or not put facts out there? I mean, it just is striking me, and the tone and the sort of the direction. We respect teachers. We know teachers are going to be factual. They're not going to come on, and we don't have a conversation before you all came on today thinking, are they going to tell us the truth or are they going to give us, the runaround? I mean, we know that FERPA, HIPAA, all those kinds of things apply. So I'm just taking a little issue with those kinds of comments.
Well, my concern is I know of no superintendent or principal who's ever taken any disciplinary action against any teacher for testifying in front of any committee or in front of the state board. And when I asked the Vermont NEA about this 3 years ago, when this bill came up in general affairs, housing and military general affairs, there were no examples of it ever having occurring. So I'm asking why it would need to be there. And do we want to tie the hands of superintendents and principals and school boards if somebody does do something that they're not supposed to do? As a superintendent, if I go to your committee and I testify and I say something that's not factual, it could cost me my job.
And I would think it would possibly be the same for a teacher. I mean, if you were right here before,
not with this language in it, not with this language, because you're telling a principal and superintendent they can't take any action against them. That's my whole point here, Senator.
That's not Senator Perslick.
Yeah, that's not how I read it, because it reads that you can't discipline for testifying. So if they're guilty of breaking the law, then you would be able to discipline them. So it's not saying they're absolved of all wrongdoing, like once they're in the witness chair, they could just do whatever they want and they're free. It's just, they can't get in trouble for testifying is the goal. And I think one of the reasons you can't find an example is because it's hard to get teachers to testify because of the concern of what happens. I mean, I think you look at the witness list today, do you see any teachers on it? And I'd say possibly it's because they don't want to come and testify in front of a bunch of principals and superintendents.
I think that's inaccurate. As a superintendent, I let my teachers testify anytime they wanted to, and I've seen Vermont NEA have teachers come and testify plenty of times, and I don't know why they would not want them to testify. They have the right to give their opinion. They have freedom of speech, just like everybody else.
Senator Chittenden.
So I don't have a strong opinion on this language either way. It's useful to hear that there's concerns. One question I'm going to have for Ledge Council at some point is there precedent for other professions or state employees or police officers? Do they have similar protections, or would we be setting a precedent with this type of protection on legislative testimony? So that's a question for me to answer over the coming week.
Okay. Mr. Nichols.
I mean, that's really it. I just want you to be careful about this language, because our biggest concern, I just wanted to bring up that last concern. The biggest concern is going to be brought up by the people talking after me. And I know as a superintendent of a poor district, we were constantly battling to have qualified people in the classroom teaching, because our teachers would leave because they could go just a little ways south and make a lot more money. And that's the biggest reason why people leave, is because they can make more money someplace else.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Nichols at this point? Okay. Thank you, Jay. Excuse me, Mr. Young, North Country Union High School. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having us here, the ability to testify on the S-162. Want to start, you have my written testimony, and as Senator mentioned, I'm currently the principal at North Country Union High School. I'd like to just first of all acknowledge that I was once a high school teacher, like many of my colleagues, and would never want to deny anyone the opportunity to maximize their earning potential or to do what's right for their family. But as the principal, it is ultimately my responsibility to ensure the educational program for the students is in place and they have everything they need to be successful. I am concerned that the 162 does appear to have the potential to perpetuate and perhaps even widen inequities that exist in our most marginalized communities. A little background on myself. I have been a principal in Vermont for 20 years. First in Craftsbury for 8 years, then in Troy for 9, and currently at North Country. I'm in my 3rd year at North Country. I'm just going to give you a couple snippets as they relate to each of those schools and how this bill, I think, might impact them. But these issues, they are prevalent in every single situation that I've been in. So in Craftsbury, for those who know, it's probably the smallest high school in the state, one of the oldest in the state. We are constantly competing for teachers from Waterbury, from Stowe, from Lamoille, and teachers are often drawn to those more populated areas. Also in Craftsbury, as you can imagine, as a small school, one teacher constitutes an entire program, and it is difficult enough to staff a small school. But if we were to think that we had a teacher on contract to teach forestry or art or whatever it is, and then we were to learn on June 14th or 15th that we no longer had that teacher, it is quite likely that that program would not run, and we would have to find other ways to either hire someone else or to figure out another way to provide that level of programming for our students. In Troy is a high SES school. So I think it's one of the highest free and reduced lunch schools in the state. It's a small K-8 school on the Canadian border. In Troy and in many small schools, I'm sure my colleagues would speak to this as well. All the scheduling is done by hand. It's not like we have a computer program that we can just punch in a bunch of numbers and it spits out the schedule that would serve the students. And what that looks like, it's a really messy time of year in the spring when we all sit down and we start talking about, all right, who's going to do this service for this student? Who's going to provide this service for this student? And it takes an immense amount of collaboration within your staff. And if this bill were to go forward and allow teachers allow us to build a schedule based on what we thought was our staffing, and then teachers leave in June, and we no longer have access to redo a schedule. If we were to lose someone, it would really put us in a tough spot. And we would be faced with a similar problem of potentially not being able to hire a replacement. If a reading specialist left, for instance, we'd be lucky to find a reading specialist to replace one who left, and we would be reassigning staff into other areas in order to provide as much services as we can for our kiddos. And finally, North Country. Again, North Country is the largest, or one of the largest geographic areas in the state. As the largest school in North Country, we don't have the problems I just outlined for Craftsbury and Troy. But we are building, in this case, I'll use ESSER funding as an example. We've devoted almost our entire ESSER allocation to building intervention systems to support students as they become re-engaged into school. We all know they've been through a year and a half of either hybrid or remote, and as they came back in, we wanted to have as many support positions in place as possible. And similar to Troy and to Craftsbury, this is all done collaboratively. There's no manual on this. There's no playbook. This is rolling up your sleeves and working with our counselors and working with our specialists and trying to come up with a schedule and a program that's going to support students. And so once that is built, it again becomes very difficult to just slide somebody in who can replace a position that was just lost. And if that is happening in the summer, the ability to collaborate with the folks that know the most about the scheduling process and about the services that need to be provided becomes exceedingly difficult. So I offer those as sort of snippets or examples of what it looks like in three very different schools, but schools that are all have the commonality of being in the Northeast Kingdom, and I think are relatively similar to other rural areas. So I'm just going to read a little bit so I don't completely lose my train of thought here, but I would like to just emphasize that the work that I was talking about is very much collaborative. We don't want to resort to top-down decision making, which often has a result of pushback. And again, if we go into the summer, we don't have the ability to provide the why, to build consensus, to gather the input that we need to make these decisions. If schools were to have to put this work on hold, we'd be left with changes to schedules, trainings, and programs that need to be made within a few short weeks, with little opportunity for this collaboration. And I apologize for the announcements going off in the background. Life in school. Our buses are leaving, and we don't want anyone to be left behind. But given the added context of the pandemic and a historically tight labor market, our human resources have been pushed to the point of breaking, and it really is difficult for me to understand the rationale behind a bill that would, I think, exacerbate existing staffing crises in our most marginalized populations. And I would just leave you with a example. I know Mark had given a story. We had a counselor last year. Was a part-time school counselor who was providing service for our students. And we did anticipate that there was going to be a significantly higher demand for social and emotional support. And we did our best to staff up for that. Part of the staffing up was to increase this counselor's time to full-time coming in to this year. Due to several situations that we did not know until August that this counselor had accepted a position in a different district. This was not a licensed position, so we had no recourse in terms of preventing that person from taking it. And it was all done kind of behind the scenes, and it wasn't really anyone's fault. Again, I certainly recognize, as Mark had talked about, the need for folks to be supported in finding the right situation for them. And it's not out of anger that I'm sharing this. It's just out of the fact that we were unable to fill that position. That position remains unfilled today. It's been posted for the entire school year. We've received 2 candidates, neither of which are viable. And in a time when we had thought we had an additional counselor, and we have a 3 counseling person team, so would be 25% of our school counseling team, that has not been available to our students this year. And so that's a real hardship. And the bottom line for me is that the longer the time period in which teachers can move into different positions with other schools, the more likely it is that the positions will go unfilled. And I think that students will suffer if that does happen. So I do urge you to consider the ramifications of this and to affirm the superintendent's ability to uphold locally agreed upon contracts. Thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. Thank you for your service to Vermonters as well.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Any questions for Mr. Young? Mr. Young, I believe you were the principal at Craftsbury Academy when at least 2 of my cousins, Kayla and Megan Pennick, were there.
Yeah.
I think they maybe in their early days. Wonderful school. Senator Perslick.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and thank you, Superintendent Young. And I really like how you started off with about, I see this as the challenge of how do we not, how do we not allow a teacher and their family to maximize their earning income without hurting the schools that are struggling to keep the teachers? And I'm totally open to how we meet that balance. And hopefully with other legislation we're doing this year, we'll be providing schools that have more students in poverty and are more rural and small, more funding, so that disparity is less. But it could just be other reasons that cause that. And you mentioned the June deadline a lot in the summer. Does it matter if it was earlier? Like, how much of a difference does that make? Although I think from your last sentence is like anytime, the longer the time, the worse it is. But you see it working where there's some set time where they say to you, yeah, I want to stay, but I'm driving an hour to get to your school. If a job opens in my town where I'm at, I'm going to apply for it. But I don't know if they're going to have a job because they're waiting for their people to give them their contract. So is there a time where it would work in your mind, or is it just any time is this unworkable? Any deadline, I mean.
I guess I would echo what Jay and Mark said earlier. I've not ever seen a superintendent and I never have myself, not supported a teacher who has come to us as early as they knew and said, I am interested in looking elsewhere. I can think of several times that we have done that. Every year this happens, and the time is built in. Either through the collective bargaining agreement or through the extensions that Mark was talking about. There was a time this year we had a teacher who did leave to move to a Chittenden County school, and her husband continues to work with us, and so she's commuting an hour and a half each way, and he asked for permission to interview in Chittenden County as well, and we granted that. I think it was into June that we allowed him to continue to interview. It was just best for him and his family, and he was very above board in coming to us with that request. So I do believe that it is already in place that teachers have the ability to go beyond an April 15th or the end of April deadline and look for other jobs. We accept that there are going to be hardships when teachers leave. I mean, that's just part of the game. The more time we have to fill the positions, again, I'm not in a small school now, but I have been, adjust the programs for if and when the positions are unfilled. That's the key. It is. I'll use the Craftsbury example again. If we were to have lost our forestry teacher, there's no way we'd be able to find a part-time forestry teacher for that 2 sections. We'd have to find something else. And so that I don't know what that exactly would be, but I think that plays out in a number of different ways in different schools, whether it's reading, whether it's an art teacher, whether it's a music teacher. There are several hard to find positions that would significantly alter the program. Again, not that we wouldn't be able to fix it. It would just take a lot of time. And it's really tough to do that in a vacuum without feedback from others.
Senator Lyons, or Senator Perslick, did you have a follow-up? You're okay. Okay, Senator Lyons.
So I have a couple of questions. Actually, Senator Perslick started in on one of them about the timing issue, but I'm going to start with the other one, which is the concern about teachers testifying. Do your schools allow for release time for teachers to testify? It seems to me, regardless of what they're saying, it's an honor to testify in the State House. At least it was before I became a senator, and it seems that way now. So my question is, do your schools provide release time, and how is that handled?
I guess my mic's on, so I'll take a stab at it. I would personally, I would consider that professional development time, and I would encourage the teacher to testify. I do similar release time for teachers for union issues and for union time. I think that is part of their professional responsibility, and I would support that.
Is there anything written into contracts about this at all, or is this just something that happens? I mean,
I don't. I think it is a. I don't believe it's written into our collective bargaining agreement. No, that might not be the case with others.
You have a follow-up, Senator Lyons.
I think Mark wanted to comment.
Mr. Tucker, we are getting tight on time.
Okay. I'm sorry. I was just wondering if she was asking everybody or just.
If you have something significantly different, then it would be helpful to know. Otherwise, I have another question.
I should answer in 2 sentences. It's in our profession. It's in our CBAs to allow professional release time.
Thank you, Senator Lyons.
But then the other question is regarding the time frame, and I'm trying to think a little bit differently about how to help with this problem, because it sounds like it's a problem on both sides of the fence. And is there a way to look at countywide or regional discussion or a pilot program that would allow for teachers and institutions, first institutions to advertise and teachers locally to have some opportunity to respond? So I'm just thinking about putting that within a more of a local or a regional pilot. I mean, you're talking statewide, and you're sending people to Chittenden County an hour and a half away. But sometimes it's just the next school over or the town over where kids go to school, where families are located. And I just wonder if there's any thought about having schools within a region or a county advertise their open positions to schools and teachers in the area as kind of a pilot. Probably doesn't make sense, but it does to me.
Well, as the next group of folks, witnesses testify, feel free to address that idea. Okay, Ms. Mclaughlin, Randolph Elementary School. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's always an honor and a privilege to testify. I've had the opportunity many a times, as well as I have had teachers and brought teachers with me, in fact, to testify in the past. So just to give you that nugget. I've been in my district now for 17. I've been a principal here in this Randolph Elementary School in Central Vermont, 17 years. And during my tenure, one of course, the many responsibilities is to find the most qualified staff. And over the years, I would have 90 to 100 applicants for teaching positions. And nowadays the pool is a fraction. It is a national emergency. I go to DC at the end of this month, and we will be talking about that concern as well, and how as a federal government, we can help to mitigate that challenge. And then when I saw this bill, I kind of gasped a little bit, because I believe this would exacerbate that already great challenge. As you know, teachers are our greatest resource for our children. And without good teachers, then our students suffer. And with teacher turnover and unexpected holes under a very short period of time to find a replacement, it's hurting kids. So my district teachers get their contracts 30 days after the vote. The town votes on our budget. That's when we are allowed to then hand out teacher contracts. They have 2 weeks after receiving their contract to decide if they plan to return or not. However, as you've heard from the others today, our teachers have the opportunity as well to talk with, ask for an extension, and never has that been a no. In fact, they can ask for multiple extensions, and that is always considered. As you've said, we don't want teachers working in a place that they don't want to be. However, that clause or that provision helps sort of gatekeep that it's not like a flood of teachers, all together leaving. So there is a sense of mutual compromise, I guess, in that process. I have not seen that it is broken, at least from my 17 years of tenure here in this district. Being a school in central Vermont in Randolph, there is not a lot to help young people gravitate towards this area, and housing in this area is also a challenge. So we've lost viable candidates due to lack of affordable housing. The addition of like Montpelier is 25 minutes away, Rutland and Burlington are an hour, and both of which have different pay situations and benefits. And so that can add a situation where people are drawn in that way. An additional challenge is the vast difference, as you've heard, again, is the teacher pay. It makes a big difference. Rural communities surrounding the bigger districts find it difficult to compete with the higher pay of those districts. So too often these lower paying districts become starter jobs for new teachers to gain experience that will then make them a more viable candidate for positions in those surrounding areas where they'll get better pay. So it causes greater turnover in lower paying districts, which often can impact, as you've heard, our marginalized students. Extending the timeline for when teachers can leave a district is only exacerbating the challenge in those rural areas as well. And as an administrator in a small rural community, it's hard to swallow the funding that we put into training our teachers to be the best they possibly can be for our children, and then to watch them walk out the door and with a longer period of time isn't necessarily the major issue. It's more a matter of, I have a shorter period of time now to help fill that gap for our children. So one safeguard is, I believe, our district having the accountability and having those applicants. When you sign a contract, I talk to my teachers, I believe it's a promise. When you sign a contract, it's a promise, and we agree together. I have a promise to follow the collective bargaining agreement just as much as they have a promise of signing a good faith agreement. It protects what's the districts, and in turn, it's a protection for our children. What is being proposed, I think, is, as you heard earlier, one-sided and in favor of the applicant, and does not give protection to our districts, which again is in turn our students. So extending the hiring window is during an already difficult hiring period is just, I have no words.
Right. Appreciate that. I'm just looking at our time because we do have Professor Teachout coming in. We're going to ask him to come a little bit later, but we scheduled about an hour for this.
Yep. I have one more point, if I may. I would say after the holiday break, knowing where teachers and this staff in general are, the COVID burnout is real. And so because I've been here 17 years and I've hired most of my staff, I asked them to please consider letting me know as soon as possible if they're going to return next year or not, because in general, people know now. And so I feel grateful and blessed for the relationship that I have with my staff. I have 6 resignations already, 1 sabbatical, and a long-term maternity until December. That doesn't count my hope of finding more collaborative teachers using the ESSER 3 funds like Chris talked about to help mitigate the challenges that COVID has brought to our children. So finding positions is going to be a huge lift. And my teachers were gracious enough to tell me now that so I can start looking.
I'm sure you appreciate that. And I also appreciate referring to the teacher shortage as indeed a national emergency that we are too going to be trying to
Thank
deal
you.
with.
I appreciate that.
Questions for Ms. McLaughlin at this point? Okay. Ms. McLaughlin, thank you very much. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
Okay, I believe it's Ms. Bonesteel is next.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Libby Bonesteel. I'm the superintendent of Montpelier Roxbury Schools, and thanks for allowing me the opportunity to speak on such an important matter. I just want to be clear that I was raised by teachers. This is the only profession for me ever in my life from my memory. I'm not here because I want to bash any opportunities teachers might have. I just want to make that really clear. Teachers are my people. It's just that I'm also responsible for providing a stable educational system for students.
Sure.
And that's incredibly important to me as well. I ask that the legislature carefully weigh the potential chaos this bill could create on systems of learning prior to putting it in law. Before I go into my written testimony that you all have, I'd like to briefly address the concerning implications of the language in the bill regarding teachers receiving retribution for testifying before this body. At MRPS, I have a really strong union leadership team and an experienced staff who have testified many times in the past. Their testimony may have had a different position than I might have, and in other instances, we share the same opinion. But when an MRPS teacher testifies, regardless of the situation, I am so amazingly proud of them for doing so. It's one of the beautiful things about this great state that we can access our legislative body so easily. And if this team would like to have MRPS teachers come testify on this exact topic, I'm happy to provide you names. The insinuation potentially codified in law that someone in educational leadership would discipline a teacher for using their First Amendment rights is something I actually take offense to and I think is unnecessary. I've had the privilege of being an administrator in 3 separate counties in Vermont, in Chittenden, in Franklin, and now in Washington County. The abilities in each of these counties and school systems to attract and retain highly quality teachers are incredibly different. Just to get a sense of how some of my administrators were feeling when I shared this bill with them, it's the worst timing ever to put this bill into effect with what we know will be a mass exodus of teachers. We can't even fill positions when we do have a timeline, so this puts schools and students at risk of starting a school year without a teacher in a classroom. There's nothing positive about this for the current state we all find ourselves in. All this will do is create more uncertainty and stress for both our leaders and teachers. We are going to have a ton of hiring to do already, and if it's anything like last year, finding licensed and qualified teachers was beyond challenging. You all can read the rest of those, but those statements are made by veteran Washington County administrators in a place that's pretty good to teach in. So it's not a question of typically in the past, can we find teachers at Montpelier Roxbury? While I haven't combed through every negotiated agreement, I would venture to guess that most CBAs have some sort of language regarding contract extension promises or processes. Without hard data, it's impossible to know if this is an actual problem that's magnified across multiple districts or if it's isolated incidences. And if it is indeed isolated instances, is it something that a law needs to happen in order to solve? Because I highly doubt it's magnified across districts. I'm wondering if the NEA can provide such data to you before making this decision. In the last MRPS negotiation cycle, this was actually a really big topic of conversation that we had with our school board and our teacher union. And we came to a really good compromise around providing extensions as yes, we would do that, and being able to post it at the same time so that we could interview immediately after the extension was over and hire a teacher. You can see the exact language in my written testimony. I just want you to imagine, if you will, if this bill as written currently came to pass. Districts could have anywhere from 1 to 25 teachers seeking employment at another school without the knowledge of the administration until the last week of school. And I bring the number 25 because some Franklin County districts, what was Franklin Northwest is now Missisquoi Valley, already faces about a 20% turnover rate yearly. So the number of 25 teachers is a very real number to some districts in our state. Administration would potentially find out about the unexpected loss of a teacher on June 15th We would need to immediately advertise for the position until there are applicants. This process at its shortest time period can take 2 weeks. Interviews will need to be set up, something that can take a few days to a week. No one will be available around the July 4th holiday to hold interviews, so that essentially pushes interviews to mid-July. This is a considerable stress on our system. And to be frank, not having a full staff by mid-July is absolute crisis for administration. Hiring would occur for these positions over the summer. Most of the hiring would be happening not in Essex or Williston or South Burlington, but in Highgate and Orleans and Roxbury. Districts would be competing for underprepared and inexperienced teachers. They would be brand new teachers, teachers who can't be hired elsewhere, or teachers who would be teaching out of their licensure area or an emergency license. This has a direct impact on the quality of education children receive. Faculty positions are hired using interview teams made up of caregivers, students, and colleagues. Creating interview teams would be next to impossible with teachers not working throughout the summer and families on vacation. So essentially, this bill could completely mute teacher, community, and student voice in the hiring process. There is a very real possibility that positions would not be filled over the summer, thus creating havoc on course offerings, class compositions, and class size, something Chris so nicely articulated in the terms of Craftsbury. We're expecting to do a tremendous amount of hiring that will be needed in the following years due to many factors: increased federal dollars, significant teacher retirement, and those simply leaving the profession because of the last 3 school years. This bill would exacerbate the stress this causes to an already stressed system. When I was the principal in Essex Town, we saw 60 to 100 qualified applicants to teaching jobs. I was an elementary principal. While I served at MVU, Missisquoi Valley Union High School, they hired a different person for the same high school math position for 5 straight years. Each year, the 3rd to 4th choice was typically the person who got the job, all hired in the summer months. MRPS will see 15 positions or 15 applicants for most of our elementary positions currently, much fewer for middle and high school positions. And at Roxbury Village School, we're lucky if we get 3 applicants, and probably 1, maybe 2 will be actually qualified. There is not an enormous pool of applicants vying for jobs outside of Chittenden County. Franklin County is a training ground for wealthier districts. Once a teacher in Franklin County has 2 to 3 years of experience, they look to move to a higher paying district. This occurs every single year. This bill would encourage that movement. This year, MRPS, my district, has 10% of our teachers working under provisional and emergency license because we couldn't find licensed candidates. That's never happened before in my career. This is the highest it's ever been. I'm sure the AOE can provide legislators with data regarding the number of provisionals and emergency licensed teachers across multiple years. I would not be as worried about the passage of this bill if there was an unlimited supply of highly qualified teachers in the state, but that's simply not the present day reality that we face. This bill could significantly increase teacher turnover in rural and high poverty areas, something Jay spoke of. There's a considerable financial cost to teacher turnover. A quick Google search will show you that there's some research studies that say in a rural district, that's about a $9,000 price tag per teacher. We have to repeat capacity building initiatives. We'd have more new teacher orientation. The cost of onboarding is significant, and an increased need for mentoring supports, where quite honestly, our teachers are pretty burned out, and we've had limited number of people wanting to do mentoring in the last couple of years. There's a hidden cost to high teacher turnover. Teachers tend to be newer to the profession. It takes a full 5 years for a highly reflective teacher to be good at their job. New teachers are learning how to manage a class, learn the curriculum, communicate effectively with caregivers, so many things a new teacher has to learn. And this all has a direct impact on student achievement. And in districts like mine that value collaboration and collective efficacy, you need trust in order to make that happen. And trust takes time to build with an increased turnover consistently, that just can't happen. And finally, and this is really important for me, I want to say, I want what's best for the teachers I work with. Teachers are rock stars. When a teacher comes to me looking to relocate because they live far away or because they're looking for a position that better fits their skill set, and they're doing so within what has been agreed upon our contract, I listen to them. I don't want people working for the students of MRPS who don't want to be there. And it's my job to provide the strongest faculty possible for the students we serve. This bill would significantly and negatively impact my ability to do this. It would have an incredible detrimental effect on our teams and increase the stress level of educators at a time when stress levels cannot go much higher. I truly ask that you reconsider some of the language in this bill.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Bonesteel? Okay, Senator Perschlick.
I know you're short on time, Chair, but I just want to say I agree with a lot that Superintendent Bonesteel said, and obviously all the languages can be reconsidered. You know, that's the whole purpose of having people come in and talk to us. And I hear pretty clearly that the problems with the June 15th deadline, for example. The goal of the legislation, you know, and this is what Superintendent Mclaughlin said about teacher shortages. I saw it as a way to help with that, where it's just a perspective. Maybe I'm coming more from the worker perspective than the employer. In that, I see this as a way to support teachers, because they're the teachers that are most successful, that care most about it, are going to be able to maximize their options because they're really good, and that's something that would attract more teachers. Not you have to ask permission to just apply for a job. And I think, you know, with the superintendents we have here, there is no problem. It's like the thing about, well, there's no problem, so we don't need, you know, it's the solution in search of a problem. It's probably true when you have really good superintendents and principals and that trust that Superintendent Bonesteel talked about. But this is really dealing with those situations where that isn't there. And how can we support those teachers? So I'm totally open to changes to the language for sure. So I'm hopeful that there is a way to find some common language that does supports the teachers and supports the schools. And I think a lot of the problems that could be exacerbated by this are problems that are caused by so many other things. You know, like our education funding, as we learned in the pupil weighting task force, is, you know, broken. And so we need to do other things to support those schools. I don't know if this contract thing is the best way to support those rural schools that have a lot of children that are in economic distress. So we need to fix that. I don't know if this is the best way to try to deal with those problems. And the last thing, I do see that it does say that it would take effect upon passage. That's an error on my part. I admit that wouldn't be my intent to try to do it this year for sure. So it could be something that would happen in the future. I know that's a small thing for the you know, the critiques that we heard, but that's just as one thing that would not be the intent to do it this year for sure. So thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, this is just our real first day of jumping into this. And I, for one, certainly open to any language changes. We have time for one more witness today on this topic. And so I am going to move to Ms. Miner. What I'm hoping we will do is for Sue Suglowski and the NEA, after we hear from Professor Teachout and our own Ledge Council, we might be able to return to this maybe around 3:45. But at this point, Ms. Miner.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak today on this important topic. I currently serve as the superintendent of Colchester schools. For context, I was a high school science teacher. I love all of my teachers, and I believe that they are critical to the success of my district. This is my 6th year serving as the superintendent of schools in Colchester, and prior to that, I served as an administrator at Colchester High School for 15 years. In both of these roles, I have been responsible for overseeing the hiring of licensed positions in my district. During this time period, I have always approached a teacher's desire to make an employment change with compassion and support, as do other superintendents in my region. I believe our hiring practices have served our teachers, school buildings, and students well. In Colchester, we do have contract deadlines. However, teachers have 2 options that they can consider if they would like to end their employment with the Colchester district. Some of these options you've already heard today. Teachers who have not signed their employment contract have the opportunity to request a contract extension. The length of the extension is determined by the superintendents, and it can be flexible based on each individual's situation. I believe this step is supportive of both the teacher and the students in the school buildings. In my district, we have then posted the position as anticipated once a contract extension has been granted. This allows us to begin the potential hiring process. If the CSD teacher would be offered a position in another district, it saves us precious time and often allows us to begin the search process during the peak interview season. It also allows us to maintain a positive relationship with that employee. This process allows us to balance the support that we want to provide to our employees in their search process while having the best chance to provide a highly qualified teacher to our students. I believe this process has served us well. If the teachers have signed their contract in April for the upcoming school year, teachers can request to be released from their contract by the school board. In Colchester, this has occurred, and as an employer, our board has been supportive. This has also required me to collaborate with other superintendents across the state, and each time this has been a collaborative process, balancing both the needs of the employee and the sending school district. I have yet to interact with a superintendent who has prevented an employee from leaving their current school district. We want our employees to be passionate about what they are teaching and where they work because it will make them better teachers. A challenge that schools do face is when we post for positions late May to August. During this time, the pool becomes slim and finding a highly qualified candidate becomes challenging. It is in these months that we risk having unfilled positions, as I do now, or offering jobs as one-year onlys, which does not provide stability to our schools. Hiring for a teacher is not as simple as posting the position and having the principal hold interviews. Our teacher interview committees include administrators, collaborative teachers that they would partner or team with, parents, and when developmentally appropriate, students. In Colchester, we always require a teaching demonstration as part of the interview process so that we can firsthand see the teaching skills that the candidate possesses. Opportunities to see potential candidates actually teach in front of a room of students become significantly more challenging when you are interviewing post-June 1. Over the past 6 years in Colchester, on average, I've needed to hire 14 teachers per year. This year, we are looking to hire at least 26 new teachers. Knowing that there are a significant number of openings across the state, I am concerned Act 162 would increase teacher mobility between districts, thus coming at a cost to our students and our school buildings. School districts are just entering the recovery phase of the pandemic, and what our schools need most right now is stability, highly qualified staff, predictability, and growth in the educator workforce. The process of onboarding, training, mentoring, curriculum alignment, and operationalizing our new teachers prior to the first day of school requires a significant amount of time and investment on our part. As drafted, Act 162 does not require the teacher to give their current district any notice that they are seeking employment elsewhere. In essence, missing the opportunity to assist their current school district in having the best opportunity to hire a qualified candidate. The absence or expectation of assisting your current school district is concerning not only for the building, but especially for the students in that school. The sooner the schools can begin any potential hiring process, even if it is anticipated, we will have better outcomes for the learners in that building. The education of Vermont students is critical to our future, and students should be at the heart of our decision-making. Strong outcomes for our students will require that schools have operational stability, which will have a direct correlation on the quality of instruction impacting the academic outcomes of Vermont students. As drafted, Act 162 states that a teacher shall not be subject to discipline by the teacher's employer for testifying. I'm not personally aware of any teacher being disciplined, and I would fully support any of my teachers or my other employees who are interested in testifying. I'm striving to understand the need for this language, and I wonder if any other employee groups in Vermont have this same level of drafted protection. In closing, I would ask you to consider why Act 162 is necessary as drafted, and more importantly, why this should be law versus a component that is locally bargained. Is there systemic statewide data and examples that teacher mobility is a systemic issue? Is there data that demonstrates that teachers have been prevented or disciplined as a result of testifying? Or does the data reflect a few isolated occurrences where the concerns could have been addressed at the local level? My final thought and wonder regarding Act 162 and this topic is whether all of this is a precursor to consideration for a statewide teacher's contract. Thank you for your time and consideration this afternoon. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Minor. I think Ms. Bonesteel also brought up the data question, which is a good one. And we'll hear from the NEA likely tomorrow to see what kind of numbers they have. In the meantime, questions for Ms. Minor? It's pretty consistent with what we've heard. Senator Perchlik.
I just wanted to thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Minor. But when I looked at the draft language, when it says the teacher receives the contract, I read that as they didn't sign the contract. So I see this as a situation where teachers haven't signed it. I think if they sign the contract, then I agree with what somebody earlier on said. I can't remember, it was Jay Nichols or somebody else. Like, if they sign the contract, then that's different than if they get an offer of the contract from the school and they say, well, I may or may not, but I don't know if this other school is going to have an opening. That was my goal, for them to have that time without having to go and ask for permission and go through that administrative process for that short amount of time. I understand the time being a problem, but that's just to clarify what my interest is. And so if that language isn't on that, then I would want to change it. But thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Yes, Senator Hooker.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Minor. You mentioned that you have 26 openings this year. Obviously, you've spoken to your teachers. Have those positions been posted on School Spring? Or I know Senator Lyons was talking about sort of regional advertising for the openings. And any of you that want to respond to this, feel free. Are these postings put up as soon as you find out about the openings?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. We do use School Spring for all of our positions in the district. We also use Indeed, so anyone across the country would have access to see those. I think School Spring's pretty common for Vermont schools to use at this point, which is helpful. As soon as we know that we have an opening, we do post them. And part of our process, and I know what some of my other superintendents do as well, is once our school boards have announced our budgets, sometimes our budgets will have new positions that we don't have currently. And that's some of my positions are those, because we're using ESSER dollars. Which is a luxury for us right now. So in those cases, I also already have them posted, and I post them as anticipated so that I can start the hiring process as early as possible. I won't, for my anticipated openings, I won't finalize those until I have a passed budget, but our goal is to get them up as soon as possible, because we all want to be hiring actively in this peak season across the district. And so it's a pretty dynamic timeframe that is fairly short. So thank you for your question. That was great.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to leave it there. We're going to take just a quick 60-second stretch/bathroom break, and then we'll return to Professor Teachout and Jim Demarais. Thank you all.